Okay, hi everyone. This is going to be, I think, the final tutorial for this series, unless I think of some other stuff. What I'm going to show you in this are two skills. The first is kind of a fun little animation idea I got from another video, which I'll show you. It's very subtle. I'll zoom in a second, but these flowers are actually kind of breathing, and I'll show you how to do that in a moment. The second thing I'm going to show you is just how to export your animation and get it to a video, which will be one of the things you'll submit for this class. So I'll get to the video part in a second, but let's have a look at these flowers. So if I zoom in and we look closely at these flowers, see how they're just very subtly moving up and down, almost like they're breathing. It's got a cool effect. And actually, one of them's not this front one. Okay, I obviously forgot to replace that when I was preparing the video. So this effect here, it's cool because it's another procedural animation effect, combining the modifiers that give the rumpled or crinkled look to the flowers with another type of modifier where we don't actually have to animate all of these little ripples or anything. We're just going to do it really in like 2 clicks. And it's a fun technique that you can use for lots of things, and I'll link the original YouTube video where I got the idea in the description. So if I have a look at my flowers, I'm going to go into my animation menu just so I can see, I guess, my animation view here, and I'll zoom in and go a little bit closer to my flowers here. And I'll put this on material preview so I can see my textures. I'm going to hide my camera because it's just a bit annoying. All right, so the first thing is, my flowers, the way I made them is that if I press G for grab and I move the flower, you'll see that the modifiers sort of change depending on where the flower is in space. If I go to solid mode, you might see that even more clearly. If yours don't do that, basically by default, the displacement modifier sets to local. And if we set the texture coordinates to local and I move it, the displacements stay fixed. However, if I set that to object, where the object is in space, and I move the object, the displacements sort of change. And this can be a really cool effect if you want to make like a blob that's flying through space. Well, you just make a shape and then make it move through its own displacements, and it will look like a sort of a blob that's flying through some weird, I don't know, outer space blobby reality. But what we're going to do is I'm simply going to rotate the x-axis just a tiny bit up and down, and it's going to make it look like, you know, some weird sort of motion as if the plant is kind of alive or something. But instead of doing like a rotation up, a rotation down, which might be a bit mechanical, I'm just going to add 1 keyframe here, and then I'm going to use another type of noise modifier, just like we did to make the crinkles on the flower itself. So first of all, I'm just going to add a keyframe on my X rotation. I'll right click and say insert single keyframe. Now, if your view here, it might be by default on the timeline. It might look like this. If what I want you to do, if it looks like this, just click on this little window here on the top left and change the editor type to graph editor. And the graph editor is a different way of looking at our keyframes. What the graph editor actually shows us is what we call the interpolation between different keyframes. And I'm just going to explain that for a second because it's kind of important. So I'm just going to quickly add another object here just to explain the interpolation. I'll scale the monkey by 0.1. I'll lift it up here. Now, if I wanted this monkey to rotate 360 degrees over the course of the animation, I could put a keyframe on the rotation here, insert keyframe, and then I could go to the end of the animation, keyframe 500, type in 360, and insert another keyframe. I'm actually going to make it rotate a bit faster so we can see it better. I'll times that by 2, so now it's 720, and I'll replace the keyframe. Oh, just replace the single keyframe. And now, if I play this animation, we'll see that the monkey starts rotating slowly, and then towards the middle, it'll be rotating faster, and then it's going to slow down again. And if we look at these keyframes on the graph editor, I'm just going to click normalize here. Maybe I'll frame selected just by pressing the numpad on my keyboard or view frame selected, we can see that what the animation is doing is it's interpolating between these two keyframes. So this curve here is showing us the animation starting slow, speeding up, and then slowing down again. If I right click on this animation and say interpolation mode linear, you'll see now what we have, if I press play, is rotation at a constant speed. So, depending on what you're animating, these types of interpolation would have different use. If you wanted to have, like an orbiting planet or something that sort of moves at a constant speed, you'd want constant interpolation. However, most movements in the physical world, at least at our scale, tend to sort of start a little bit slow, speed up, and then slow down due to physical forces like inertia and so on. So that's why by default, I think, the interpolation is usually Bezier, because that's sort of, I guess, the most commonly used animation interpolation. So we're not actually having to worry about interpolation for our flower because we're only using one keyframe, so therefore there's nothing to interpolate between. But I just wanted to explain that basic function of the graph editor because it's really useful when you're sort of changing the properties of how an animation moves from one keyframe to another. Okay, so back to this flower. So I've added a single keyframe here on the x-axis, and instead of adding another one and sort of making the rotation move, like if I went to 20 and then changed this number to 5 and then inserted another keyframe, we'd have the flower moving up and down. What I'm going to do, I'll just delete that keyframe by clicking on it, pressing X, delete keyframe. I'm going to go back to the beginning, and what I'm going to do is I'm just going to add a modifier here, and it's going to be a noise modifier. And just before I show you, I've realized it's a bit distracting having some of my other petals already animated, so I'm just going to delete their modifiers and I'll re-add them with you because I sort of prepared this and I didn't reset it so I could show you the final effect. I'll just delete these keyframes. Okay, so now we just have the movement on this first flower. If I play it now, it'll look ridiculous. The flower's jumping up and down. But what's cool about it is it's jumping up and down randomly between a range. So we can see that what this red line here represents, that's random noise on the X rotation channel going between 0.5 and minus 0.5. And if I slide up the scale here, what that's going to do, we can see the curve a bit more, but in practice, it's going to slow down the movement. So if you remember those interpolation curves we saw before when I added two keyframes, now we've got an animation curve that's just using random noise. And it's quite cool because now if I press play, okay, it's still too much. That could be good if something is really blowing in the wind. What I can also do is change the strength. So that'll change how much rotation, or basically the amplitude of this curve. So if I put that to 0.1 and hit enter, you'll see now the curve's amplitude is very low, and we've got a kind of like a nice subtle movement. So you could change the scale, number, or whatever you like, and you might not be using this for the flowers, you might find a totally different function for this noise modifier, but I was just thinking of a way to include it, so I thought I'd make breathing flowers, just a sort of a weird, subtle, slow movement. So the final thing I want to show you is how to apply this to all the flowers. We don't have to go through this whole process of changing these numbers all the time. We can basically just insert a keyframe on each petal and do the same thing. So what I've done is I've actually opened up my flower group and I've just found, the first flower I have here. I've opened it up and here are my petals. So I'm just going to click through them one at a time. Click on this one, which is back here. Looks like I forgot to delete that keyframe. Okay, so I'll just right click, insert a single keyframe. And now if I go back to the first one, I can actually copy and paste it. For some reason, if I go like, Control C, Control V, it doesn't work with these animation modifiers or curve modifiers, but we've got a copy and paste button here. So I'm just going to click that to copy and then go to the next one that I added the keyframe on, click paste. and then I'll just do that for the other petals. So I'll click on the next petal, right click, insert keyframe, paste. Next petal, right click, insert keyframe, paste. The next one, right click, insert keyframe, paste. And the last one, right click, insert keyframe, paste. So now if I scroll through my timeline, you'll see that the flower is sort of, it looks kind of interesting. It does, you know, it is sort of breathing up and down in a sort of a weird way. So I thought that's something kind of cool. And you could, you know, change how each one of these is animating. You can change its offset so they're all breathing, you know, out of sync. Who knows? You know, who knows what's going to look interesting? Like if I give these all a bit of a random offset, and I grab this, and it might look quite different. See, now they're all kind of moving independently, like each different petal has kind of a life of its own. That might be an effect that looks cool depending on what you're doing. Okay, so, you know, to apply that to the rest of your flowers, it'll just be the same thing. I've still got that modifier in my clipboard, so I just add a keyframe and paste. And if you're wondering why you don't see the modifiers tab here, you'll only see that after there's a keyframe to add the modifier to. And the video that I'll link in the description, it actually uses the noise modifier on the camera. And the reason that the YouTuber does that is it gives you like a handheld camera effect. It adds a little bit of a shake and a wobble. So if I do that, say to my Z location here, insert a keyframe and paste it, now you'll see my camera is kind of moving up and down, probably moving way too much. It's probably a bit weird. But in the video, I'll link, you know, he gets a nice balance of the right type of movement to get a handheld camera. A handheld camera might not be the right sort of, you know, sort of vibe for an animation that's meant to be a painting, so I don't recommend that. But the idea is that you can sort of use these noise modifiers as a clever way to animate all sorts of particularly organic things. He also shows, like, he gets a character that's a crab that's just sort of menacingly bouncing around. It looks very cool. So you can check that out in the description. So let's now go back to the output of how to get this out to a video. It's really only a few clicks. We go to our render tab, and if I just finally check, I look back in my rendered view, let's say I've finished all my lighting and I'm really happy with the animation and everything, just to output it. Okay, so I'm set to Eevee in the render tab, which, as we mentioned, is the most efficient render engine for us to use. Cycles will be very slow, so we're going to use Eevee. And then I go to my output properties. 1920 by 1080 resolution is fine. That's our standard high definition. Then you might need to make some changes here. The first one is the output location. By default, it's probably going to like a temporary folder on your computer. Instead, I want you to click the file browser and add it to a folder in your project directory called frames. If you don't have that folder yet, just make a new folder with this button here and call it frames. And then obviously I've done lots of different animations for this class. So I'm just going to add it to a folder. I'll make another one. Let's call it Vanitas 2. And I'll click there and click accept. The next thing we want to look at is the file format. In this case, I'm going to use a PNG file. And the reason for that is a PNG file is, you know, a reasonably common output file to use for an animation because it has an alpha channel. And an alpha channel means that, let's say you're animating something that has a transparent background that you might want to composite on top of something else later. A PNG file can carry an alpha channel, whereas a JPEG won't. The other question you might have is, okay, you know, we can see MPEG-4 video here. Why don't we just output straight to a video? The reason for that is that will bring in, one, a lot of compression. It'll be outputting a single file, so if our render crashes, then we don't get anything. And two, if we output PNG files, what we're going to get is actually a frame sequence that, let me just navigate to my teaching folder here. What we will get at the end of this, if I go to frames, Vanitas 1, is we're going to get an image for every single frame. And if I just make these a little bigger so you can see them, we're going to get a whole lot of images like this. And this is giving us, a lossless render where every single frame is rendered perfectly. And then when we want to make a video, then we add our compression. The other benefit with this is that if it stops halfway, you just restart at the image, at the next image. You might have, maybe it got up to, maybe it did your first 100 frames perfectly and something went wrong and it crashed. Well, then you just set your render, if you go into Blender, instead of starting at frame 1, which would be, where's our frame range? Here, we could put this at frame 100 and it will start rendering from frame 100. So that's, there's lots of reasons why we always render to an image sequence first. Okay, so I've set my image sequence to PNG. I'm going to leave my color space at RGB. That's because I don't have any transparency here. But if I had an object and I wanted to keep a transparent background, I'd have RGBA, which is red, green, blue, and alpha. And then I'll leave all of this in place. So now that I've set my render path, which is here to my Vanitas frames, I click accept. That's all set up and ready to go. So what I will now do is just click render, render animation, and it's going to render one frame at a time. And this might take a little while. Here I can see how long it took there. It took 4 seconds for that frame. And so, if it's taking 4 seconds per frame and it's a 500 frame animation, then, I don't know, do your maths, 2,000 seconds, calculate how many minutes that is. I'm not going to do that in my head. And also, if you're getting really long render times, like 1 minute per frame, then the first thing to do is look at your scene and maybe there's something slowing it down. Maybe you've got too much detail. There's a whole list of things I've put in the class document that gives ideas for if your render is very slow, different ways you can speed it up. And that's also something you can ask me in class. Okay, I'm just going to press escape and cancel this render because I've already rendered my frames. And now I'm going to show you how to compile them into a video. Before I close this file, I'm just going to save it. And what I recommend is always do your compiling in a second Blender file. I find this just more convenient. I'll show you why in a moment. But right now I'm just going to create a new file. And when I go into new, we can even click video editing as the sort of default setup for the file. So if I do that, it's automatically going to put me in a video editing sort of tab here. Actually, that's a little bit annoying. I'm just going to do a new one and do a general. And from here, I'm just going to open up the video editing tab, just so I still have all my other tabs here. But the effect is more or less the same. Just I want to demonstrate something when I've finished showing you the video edit. Okay, so if I've got this empty scene here, I want to bring in all of those frames that we just rendered. So I would just press Shift A and add image sequence, or I could just go into the add menu and also click image sequence. And I'll go into in this case, I just rendered 11 frames as I was talking, but I'll go into the one I did previously where I rendered all the frames. I'll just click A to select all of them and click add image strip. And by default, a Blender scene is 250 frames, whereas the previous animation we made was 500 frames. So I just have to change the duration here, change the end to 500, click enter. And now if I go back to the beginning and press spacebar for play, now it's running a lot faster. It's running at 24 frames per second, and it's showing us the actual speed of our animation, because now we're not actually looking at a 3D scene, we're just looking at these two-dimensional frames. So this is what we'd export to our video. Also, if you have sound, you can, if I press G and Y and move this up, we can also add sound. You might have music or sound effects or anything. If you've got some interesting like sounds that maybe you could make some clinking sounds for this ball hitting the gold or anything like that. You just add that in your timeline and just treat it exactly like you'd treat a regular video edit. This is just the same as Premiere or anything like that. You can also do more advanced things with like changing the color, changing the size. I won't go into that now, but Blender is a pretty good basic video editing program. What I'm going to do now is simply re-export it as a video, which will be very quick. So same as before, I'll just go to my output file tab here, set the directory to my project. This time I'll go to my video file and I can just put it in here, click accept, and I'll change the file format from PNG, which was the image file, now to FFmpeg video. And we can change a few settings here. You can use a Matroska container or MP4, both will work fine. If you have sound, make sure in the audio codec, just select like MP3 is fine. That'll just make sure that it's actually exporting sound as well. And then I think that's all we need to change. Then we just go to render and render animation again, and we'll see it's going much, much faster. Here it's going like, you know, many frames per second, because it's not re-rendering every frame from 3D, it's just compiling them into a video. So it's going pretty quick, and this will be done probably by the time I finish this sentence, if I can think of ways of making this sentence longer by saying more words, until finally it's going to get to the end of the sentence and the render's done. Okay, so that will now mean that if I go back to my Finder and look in my video, this file just automatically named itself to the, you know, the frame sequence, and if I press spacebar, you know, there's my animation. Happy, happy, happy. So the final thing I wanted to show you, because this is an error that I sometimes get, if you've been editing a video in your video editing tab here, and you've used the same Blender file, let's say I'm making a, you know, lovely, I don't know, composition of green cubes here, and I've spent lots of time on it, and I go to my animation tab and I put this in rendered mode and I hit render image, I'm going to get an image not of the cubes but of whatever's in my video editing compiler. So, and it can be super annoying. So that's why I recommend I usually just make a totally separate file for my video editing. And actually, while we're here, I'll just save this, save as, and I can call it like Vanitas video editor.blend. And then I've got that separate file that I can use later. Okay, so that's it. Now you've learned how to make this weird little noise-based animation on the flowers, as well as how to export your animation as a frame sequence, which you can then just compile into a video. Oh, one other thing, you know, if I wanted to make a loop of this, I could just duplicate, just like any video editing program, and I could make the video go over and over again, or I could even make it play in reverse. I'd just grab the second sequence and try to remember where the setting was. Video, reverse frames, so now it'll go, ball goes down, ball goes back up. You know, so it's just like a video editor. And you can, you know, especially if you've only rendered a short animation but you want it to play on loop, sometimes it can be nice to put a few different loops in your video file, just so whatever you're playing it on doesn't have to reset every time. Okay, that's it. Thanks everyone, and I'll see you in class. Bye-bye.